The bell above the door jangled, a harsh and brittle sound that seemed to shatter the freezing silence of the general store, announcing May's presence to a room that did not want her there. Outside, the wind whipped through the canyon, carrying the biting dust of a high country winter, but inside the air was stagnant, smelling of cured tobacco, stale flour, and the damp wool of men who had been working in the snow. May stood near the counter, her fingers trembling not just from the pervasive cold that seeped through the thin, rose-colored silk of her cheongsam, but from a hunger that had hollowed her out from the inside. She was 30 years old, though the shadows under her eyes made her look older, and she carried a heavy canvas sack that dragged against the rough floorboards. Every eye in the room turned toward her, some with indifference, others with open hostility, but she fixed her gaze on the wood grain of the counter, refusing to acknowledge the sudden quiet that had fallen over the card game in the corner. She lifted the sack and placed it on the counter, the heavy thud of metal against wood causing Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, to look up from his ledger with a sneer of impatience. He was a man who measured worth in cattle and ammunition, and he had made it clear weeks ago that he had no use for a woman who could not scrub floors or cook stew. May unrolled the canvas slowly, her hands red and stiff, revealing the treasure she had guarded since the day the fever took Chin. There were chisels with handles of polished ash, a heavy brass-backed saw, a block plane with a blade honed to a mirror finish, and an auger that looked heavy enough to anchor a ship. These were not the rusted, blunt instruments found in a common barn. They were the extensions of a master joiner's soul, tools that had built half the furniture in the valley before the sickness came. Abernathy poked at the plane with a grimy finger, leaving a smudge on the steel. "I told you, girl," he grunted, not bothering to look her in the eye. "I ain't running a museum. Nobody here needs fancy cabinet maker trash. We need plows and hammers. I'll give you $2 for the scrap metal. The wood handles make good kindling." The offer was an insult so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The tools were worth $50 easily, enough to feed her for the winter and buy a ticket to the coast in the spring. May swallowed the lump of pride that tasted like ash in her throat. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Steel is good. Sheffield steel. Chin, my husband, he kept them sharp. They are worth more." Abernathy laughed, a dry, barking sound. $2. Take it or drag 'em back out in the snow." The door opened again, bringing a gust of Arctic air that made the lantern flames dance, and a man stepped in, stomping the snow from heavy boots. He was tall, wearing a sheepskin coat that had seen better years, and a hat pulled low over eyes that scanned the room with the weary precision of a predator. The room shifted. The card players sat up straighter, and even Abernathy straightened his posture. This was Grant, a man whose name carried weight in the territory, owner of the Double Bar Ranch that sat in the valley's throat, taking the brunt of every storm. He didn't speak to the men. He walked straight to the counter, intending to order grain, but his eyes stopped on the canvas roll. He paused, his gloved hand hovering over the block plane. May instinctively pulled back, afraid he would knock it aside, but instead Grant pulled off his glove. His hand was calloused, scarred from barbed wire and rope, but he touched the wooden handle with a surprising gentleness. He ran his thumb along the flat of the blade, testing the edge without cutting himself, a move that only a man who understood tools would make. "Rosewood handles," Grant said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "And that saw, that's a dovetail pull saw. Who sharpened this?" May looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. They were gray, like the winter sky, but they held no mockery, only a calm, exacting curiosity. "My husband," May said, her voice steadying. "He is gone. I must sell." Abernathy interjected quickly, sensing a shift. "Just offered her $2, Grant. It's junk, mostly. Too delicate for ranch work." Grant ignored the shopkeeper entirely, picking up a heavy framing chisel and feeling its balance. "This isn't junk, Abernathy. This is precision. You couldn't buy this in the city for 20. He looked at May, really looked at her, seeing the shivering frame beneath the pink silk, the hunger in her hollow cheeks, and the desperate dignity in the way she stood. "You know how to use these?" he asked. The question was a test. May hesitated. She had never been the carpenter. She had been the one who held the wood, who oiled the blades, who watched Chin for 10 years until the rhythm of the work was part of her own heartbeat. "I know how they work," she said carefully. "I know how to keep them true." Grant nodded, a decision forming behind his eyes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, dropping a $20 gold piece on the counter. The sound rang out like a gunshot. "I'll take them," he said, "and I'll take you too. I've got a wagon outside. My bunkhouse door is sheared off the track, and the draft is killing my horses. If these tools are as good as you say, you're going to fix it." The ride to the ranch was a journey through a white, frozen purgatory. May sat on the buckboard seat beside Grant, wrapped in a rough wool blanket he had tossed at her without a word. The pink silk of her cheongsam peeked out from beneath the gray wool, a splash of defiant color against the monochrome landscape of snow and slate rock. They did not speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of the wagon wheels breaking the crust of the snow and the labored breathing of the horses. May held the canvas tool roll on her lap, clutching it like a child. The gold coin burned in her pocket. It was enough to leave, to run, but she was going deeper into the wild, driven by a strange obligation to the man who had recognized the value of her husband's legacy. Why had she agreed? Perhaps because the look in Grant's eyes had offered a transaction of competence rather than pity. He hadn't offered charity. He had offered a job. As the wagon crested the final ridge, the Double Bar Ranch came into view. It was not the romantic sprawl of storybooks. It was a fortress against the elements. The main house was low and hunkered down, while the massive barn loomed like a wooden cathedral, its roof heavy with snow. Smoke rose in thin, desperate ribbons from the chimneys. As they pulled into the yard, a group of ranch hands stopped their work to watch. They were hard men, bundled in furs and canvas, their faces obscured by scarbs, but their eyes tracked May with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. A woman on the ranch was rare. A Chinese woman in a silk dress holding a sack of tools was an anomaly that defied their understanding. Grant hauled on the reins, bringing the wagon to a halt. "Don't mind them," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "They respect work, nothing else." He climbed down and offered a hand, not to help her down like a lady, but to steady her like a coworker. May took it, her small hand swallowed by his grip. He led her not to the house, but directly to the barn. The massive sliding door, a structure of heavy oak planks and iron strapping, was hanging askew, effectively useless. The wind howled through the gap, and inside the horses stomped nervously in the freezing draft. "Track bent," Grant said, pointing to the iron rail above. "Roller snapped. Every time we try to force it, it jams worse. The cold is snapping the iron, but the wood is warping too. I need the wood reseated so the new roller sits flush. Can you do it?" May looked at the massive door. It weighed hundreds of pounds. This wasn't fine cabinetry. This was heavy structural repair. Fear spiked in her chest. If she failed, the gold coin would feel like theft. But then she touched the wood of the door frame. It was oak, frozen solid but familiar. May set the tool roll on a bale of hay and unbuckled the straps. The ranch hands had gathered now, forming a loose circle, their breath steaming in the cold air. A man with a scarred lip, the foreman likely, spat into the straw. "Boss, this is a joke. She's going to break a nail, not fix the door." Grant didn't answer. He just leaned against a post, crossing his arms, waiting. May stripped off the blanket. The cold hit her instantly, sharp and cruel, but she needed to move. She approached the door, examining the joint where the heavy roller bracket met the wood. The wood had swollen and twisted, putting torque on the metal until it snapped. To fix it, she didn't just need to replace the metal, she needed to recut the mortise, the pocket in the wood, to align with the warped grain. It was a job for a strong man with a heavy mallet. May picked up the brass-backed saw and a wide chisel. She didn't have the strength to muscle the wood into submission, so she had to use leverage and geometry. She climbed onto a crate to reach the top of the door. The men murmured, a low ripple of doubt. May closed her eyes for a second, summoning the memory of Chen's hands guiding hers. "Let the tool do the work," he would say. "Don't fight the grain. Follow it." She placed the saw against the protruding ridge of warped oak. The first stroke was tentative, the saw skittering on the ice-hardened timber. A snicker rose from the back of the room. May tightened her jaw. She angled the blade, finding the rhythm, the pull stroke that Japanese and Chinese saws were famous for. The teeth bit. Sawdust, pale and fragrant, began to drift down like snow. She worked with a focus that blurred out the cold, the staring men, and her own hunger. She wasn't just cutting wood. She was carving out a space for herself in a world that wanted to crush her. The saw sang, a high-pitched rhythm that silenced the barn. When the cut was deep enough, she swapped for the chisel. She positioned the blade and used the heel of her hand to drive it, paring away the waste wood in clean, curling shavings. It was precise, surgical work on a massive, brute object. Hours seemed to pass, though it was likely only 40 minutes. May's hands were raw, her knuckles white, but the new channel was cut. It was smooth, level, and perfectly angled to counteract the warp of the door. She stepped down, her legs trembling from the strain. "It is ready for the iron," she said, her voice small in the cavernous space. Grant stepped forward, inspecting the work. He ran a gloved finger along the fresh cut. It was flat as a lake surface. He looked at the foreman. "Bring the spare roller." The foreman hesitated, then obeyed, bringing the heavy iron caster. Grant lifted it, he had to use both hands, and slotted it into the space May had prepared. It slid in with a satisfying, solid thunk, the metal seating perfectly against the wood with no gaps. There was no wobble. The geometry was perfect. Grant bolted it down, the ratchet clicking loudly in the silence. Then he grabbed the edge of the massive door and pulled. Usually it took 2 men to drag it shut. With the new alignment, the door glided along the track, heavy but smooth, and slammed shut with a definitive boom that cut off the howling wind. The silence that followed was instant and warm. The draft was gone. The horses settled. The ranch hands looked from the door to the small woman in the pink silk, their expressions shifting from mockery to a grudging, bewildered respect. Grant turned to May. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders had dropped. "Clean work," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. He reached into his pocket, not for money this time, but for a key. "Go to the house. Tell the cook to give you a hot meal and a bath. You're not sleeping in the barn." May looked at the tools, then at him. "I must clean them first," she said. "The sap will rust the steel." Grant stared at her for a long moment, realizing that for her, the tools were not just instruments, but the only family she had left. "Clean them," he agreed softly. "Then come inside. We have more broken things around here than just a door." As May wiped the sawdust from the chisel, she realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She had just built the first step of a new life. The kitchen of the Double Bar Ranch was a stark contrast to the frozen blue twilight outside. It was a world of yellow lantern light, the smell of rising sourdough, and the constant rhythmic clatter of Mrs. Gable, the cook, who moved with the bustling energy of a woman who had fed hungry men for 40 years. May sat at the corner of the heavy pine table, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of black coffee, the heat seeping into her palms. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks. In that time, the pink Cheong Sam had been carefully folded away, replaced by a gray flannel shirt and a canvas skirt that Mrs. Gable had altered to fit May's slender frame. The transition had not been seamless. The ranch hands still watched her with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, unsure how to classify a woman who smelled of sawdust rather than rosewater. But inside the house, a quiet routine had begun to calcify, binding her to the place. The draft that had plagued the kitchen for years, whistling through the warped sash of the west-facing window, was the current enemy. Grant had mentioned it in passing over breakfast, a casual complaint about the room never holding heat, and by noon May had dismantled the frame. She worked now on the table, the sash clamp tightened, carefully planing the edge of the swollen wood. Grant stood by the stove, ostensibly warming his hands after a day riding the fence line, but his eyes were fixed on her. He watched the way she held the block plane, her index finger extending along the brass edge to guide it, her movements economical and fluid. There was an intimacy in the silence, a shared understanding of the work that felt louder than conversation. He walked over, the spurs on his boots chiming softly, and placed a fresh pot of coffee on the trivet near her elbow. "You're taking too much off," he said, his voice low, lacking the command he used with the men, replaced by a tentative suggestion. May didn't look up, but a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "The wood is wet," she replied softly, blowing a curl of shaving away. "When it dries in the spring, it will shrink. If I fit it tight now, it will rattle then. I fit it for the future, not for today." Grant paused, absorbing the philosophy that seemed to apply to more than just the window. He looked at her hands, rougher now, healing from the cold cracks, but capable, and felt a strange, terrifying warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. "You think about the future a lot?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. May stopped planing. She looked at the window, then at him, her dark eyes reflecting the lantern flame. "I think about what lasts," she said. "Everything else is just wind." The winter deepened, turning the valley into a crucible of ice and wind that tested every beam and bolt on the ranch. The crisis came on a Tuesday night, a storm that hit with the violence of a derailed train, shaking the main house to its foundations. The wind screamed like a living thing, tearing shingles from the roof and driving snow through cracks no one knew existed. Just after midnight, a terrible groaning sound echoed from the yard, audible even over the gale. Grant was out of bed and into his boots in seconds, grabbing his heavy sheepskin coat. May met him in the hallway, clutching a lantern, her hair loose around her shoulders. "The windmill!" Grant shouted over the noise. "The brake line must have snapped. If it spins out of control in this wind, it'll tear itself apart and take the water tank with it." He pushed out into the storm, and without asking for permission, May grabbed her own coat and followed. Outside, the world was a blinding white vortex. The massive windmill blades were spinning with terrifying speed, the machinery screaming as the metal heated up. If the tower collapsed, they would lose their water source for the cattle. It would be a death sentence for the herd. Grant was already at the base, struggling with the emergency brake lever, a long iron bar that was frozen in the disengaged position. He hauled on it with all his weight, his boots slipping on the ice, but the rust and ice had welded it fast. "It won't move!" he roared, his voice snatched away by the wind. May saw the problem immediately. It wasn't about strength, it was about mechanical disadvantage. The fulcrum was frozen. She ran to the barn, fighting the wind that threatened to blow her sideways, and returned minutes later with a heavy iron pry bar and a sledgehammer. She didn't try to help him pull. She went to the pivot point of the lever. "Grant, pull when I strike!" she screamed. She swung the sledgehammer, not with wild panic, but with the calculated force she used to drive mortises. The steel head struck the frozen joint with a deafening clang. Ice shattered. Grant grunted, hauling down. She struck again, The joint groaned. On the third strike, she wedged the pry bar under the locking pin and threw her weight onto it while Grant pulled the lever. With a screech of protesting metal, the brake engaged. The blades slowed, fighting the wind until they ground to a halt, locked and safe. They slumped against the base of the tower, huddled together in the snow, breathing hard. Grant looked at her, his face encrusted with ice, and in the chaos of the storm he laughed, a sound of pure relief. He pulled her into his side to shield her from the wind, his arm heavy and protective. For the first time, May didn't pull away. She leaned into the rough wool of his coat, feeling the thud of his heart against her own, realizing that survival was a task better shared. The days following the storm were quiet, a period of recovery as the ranch dug itself out from the drifts. The adrenaline of the windmill repair had shifted something fundamental between them. It was no longer employer and employee. There was a partnership that had been forged in the danger of that night. One evening, the fire in the main hearth was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows across the rug. Grant sat in his leather armchair, cleaning a rifle, the smell of gun oil mixing with the scent of the pine logs. May sat on the floor near the hearth, sharpening her chisels with a whetstone and oil. Grant set the rifle down and watched her. "You never talk about him," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. May's hand paused on the stone. She didn't need to ask who he meant. "There is no need," she said, keeping her eyes on the blade. "He is in the tools. When I use them, he is there. When I stopped using them, that was when he was truly dead." She looked up at Grant, her expression open and vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed. "Selling them was giving up. You gave them back to me." Grant leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face illuminated by the firelight. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deep, but his gaze was intense. "I didn't buy them for charity, May. I bought them because I saw someone who knew the value of things. I've spent 10 years building this place alone, thinking that if I just worked hard enough, the silence wouldn't matter." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers before he gently covered her fingers, stopping the sharpening motion. His hand was large, rough, and warm. "I was wrong. The silence is the hardest part. You broke the silence, May. Not with noise, but with presence." May turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. It was a small gesture, terrified and brave all at once. The ghost of her husband didn't stand between them. Instead, the competence he had taught her became the bridge to this new man. "I am not going to the coast in the spring," she whispered. "I know," Grant replied, his thumb brushing her wrist. "You're already home." Spring arrived not with flowers, but with mud, deep, clinging mud that signaled the end of the freeze. The world turned brown and green, and the ranch exploded into activity. It was time for repairs, for calving, for life to resume at full speed. Abernathy, the shopkeeper from town, drove his buggy up the muddy track one afternoon, eyeing the improvements to the ranch with a skeptical scowl. He had heard rumors about the China woman running the double bars repairs, and he had come with a proposition that masked his curiosity. He found Grant and May by the corral. May was measuring lumber for a new gate, wearing her work clothes, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Abernathy climbed down, ignoring May to address Grant. "Grant, I got a shipment of pine coming in. Green wood, but cheap. Figured you'd need it for the new bunkhouse. I can cut you a deal if you sign for it now." Grant didn't answer immediately. He turned to May. "What do you think, boss?" The title was said with a dry humor, but the respect behind it was real. Abernathy scoffed. "Asking her? She's likely to build you a fan, not a bunkhouse." May stepped forward, her face calm, holding the measuring tape like a weapon. "Green pine twists," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "It cups when it dries. If we build a bunkhouse with it now, by autumn the walls will have gaps big enough for rats. We need kiln-dried fir, or we wait for the cedar to season." She looked Abernathy in the eye. "Cheap wood is expensive, Mr. Abernathy. You sell the green pine to someone who doesn't know better. We will take the cedar." Abernathy opened his mouth to argue, looking to Grant for support, but Grant was leaning against the fence, a look of immense satisfaction on his face. "You heard the lady," Grant drawled. "She runs the build. If she says cedar, we buy cedar. And if you disrespect her judgment again, you can turn that buggy around and don't come back." Abernathy flushed red, muttering under his breath, but he nodded. The shift in power was absolute. As the buggy rattled away, Grant looked at May. "Boss?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. "Well," Grant smiled, a rare, full expression that crinkled his eyes. "You are bossy. Might as well make it official." The wedding was not a spectacle. It happened 3 weeks later, on a day when the sky was a piercing, limitless blue. They stood in the small chapel in town, Grant in a clean black suit that felt stiff on his shoulders, and May in a dress she had made herself, not white, but a pale, dusty blue silk that matched the horizon, embroidered with subtle patterns of pine branches and silver thread. There were no crowds, just Mrs. Gable, the foreman, and the minister. The vows were simple, spoken in low voices that trembled slightly with the weight of the promise. But the true ceremony happened later, back at the ranch. The sun was setting, casting a gold light over the valley. Grant led May to the barn, not to the main area, but to a small annex he had been building in secret for months. He slid the door open. Inside it smelled of fresh sawdust and potential. There was a workbench, massive and sturdy, built from solid oak with a vise of German steel. The walls were lined with racks, empty and waiting. Grant walked over to the corner where May's canvas sack lay. He picked it up and placed it on the bench. "I can't give you the past," Grant said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I can't promise the winters won't be hard. But I can promise you a place to build whatever you want." May ran her hand over the smooth surface of the bench. It was the finest piece of furniture on the ranch. She opened the canvas roll, taking out the brass-backed saw, the chisels, the plane. She placed them into the racks, one by one, claiming the space. When the last tool was hung, she turned to Grant. She didn't say thank you. Instead, she stepped forward and placed her hands on his chest, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him. A kiss that tasted of hope and the long, slow thaw of spring. "We have work to do," she whispered against his lips. Grant wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against the coming night. "Yes," he said, "we do." And outside, the wind blew through the valley, no longer a threat, but a song.